For the love of rugby, brought to you by Blackheart, for those who ruck, maul and never back down. Now, Warren Gatland has left the Wales job in the middle of the Six Nations. They've lost 14 tests in a row now, and he's gone. We actually put out a video this morning, and I was talking about the next Wales coach potentially and where they're at, and I thought there wouldn't be any change for the end of Six Nations. And I said to the Welsh fans, I said, there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's not much you can do about it. There will be change at the end of the Six Nations. Like all my predictions, they're not always that accurate, because a few hours later, it's been announced that he's gone. Now, I'm Ben Youngs, and I'm joined by the one and only Squidge Rugby. Please check out his YouTube channel. And he is an absolute Welsh ultra. So how are you feeling, mate? Happy with the news? Sad? What's your take on it?
It's a weird one, isn't it? I think I watched, that back this morning as I was going about my business in the morning. And again, very much thinking on it this morning, you're thinking, well, at the end of the Six Nations, that's when the change has to happen. And this Welsh team, as you mentioned, have lost 14 games in a row. Last year was the first time since 1938 they went a whole year without winning a test match. And even then, they only played 4 games in that year. They played 12 last year. This has been the worst run of results Wales have ever been on. No coach can and should be able to survive that. And yet, you hear the news through, you hear that he's gone, you see the press conference come out and the reports that come through before that. And it is sad. There is this kind of hangover from why he's been there for so long, why we've had him there, because this is the most successful and in many ways the best coach Wales have ever had. And yet, here we are. He's gone. It's over. That era is done for a second time. It's an unusual feeling.
I mean, the Sage Insights tell us that this is the worst Wales side in 144 years, which is crazy. Now, I've got to just say that there is, we've recorded this before the press conference. It's done at scheduled for 3 p.m. today. So there may be a little bit meat on the bone left, but this is the information we're working with. So I just want to say that. I've got to say, though, is it, from my point of view, looking in from the outside, is given the autumn, and given there was a review and there was a breakdown after the autumn of where Wales are at and etc., why is it after 2 games of Six Nations you're getting rid of it or departing ways when you had the autumn? And that was the perfect time to probably depart ways then and try and find someone else to come in, or someone just steps up in the meantime for the Six Nations and holds the fort until the right person comes along. It kind of looks a bit desperate and dysfunctional.
Yeah, that's the issue, isn't it? That I think there's an awful lot of Welsh fans, myself included, that kind of assumed Gatland was going to go regardless at the end of the Six Nations, because you couldn't see anything other than, you couldn't see more than 2 wins at absolute most, but even then 1 felt like the ceiling, really. And so you are thrown suddenly into this situation where everyone's assuming the coach is on borrowed time, because most likely they are, unless there's one freak result out of nowhere. And yet the change hasn't been made. You wonder whether it was really made because there is supposedly a break clause in Gatland's contract this summer coming up, and they wanted to get as close to that as possible so they wouldn't need a big payout. Apparently he's parted on mutual terms, that it's a mutual decision after the loss to Italy. So that probably has something to do with it. The fact that Gatland was quite buoyant after the last game of the autumn against South Africa, that he wanted to stay. So maybe it's just a case of the financials of the Welsh Rugby Union spent over $1 million in 2023 getting rid of members of staff in Steve Phillips, the former CEO, and then also Wayne Pivac and his assistant coaches. So it's probably just trying to keep that cost down, but it's led to Wales having 2 absolutely torrid performances here. That 15 points Wales have scored in the first 2 games put together, which is the lowest of any team in Six Nations history.
Squidge, I've got to ask, essentially the WRU review of the autumn, as I just touched on before, they said that Gatland was the right man for the job. So therefore, has the review failed, or is it as simple as they weren't prepared to depart ways in terms of a settlement fee at that point, and they just kind of knew they just had to do it this way?
It's strange, because I think there's a little bit of you that goes, well, did Gatland, just having done everything he's done in the past, has he earned that chance to kind of prove it and set things right once and for all? And they maybe went that Italy game second up. You've got France as a free hit, almost a warm up, and then we'll see how that Italy game goes, whether that turns things around. But I don't know, it's an odd one. Like, and now the players are left mid Six Nations, which is the huge call. It's not they've given him the full campaign. Mid Six Nations have got to change. Like if you don't mind me asking, like you've played in teams where coaches have changed mid-season. Like, how is that transition? How is that change?
I have. I've had it a few times at Leicester. Nationally, Eddie left in the autumn, didn't he? But there was a bit of a gap between that and, of course, Six Nations. But mid-tournament, internationally, no, that's not happened to me from what I can remember. It's strange because the way I see it, and I've had it at Leicester, if things are that bad and you're not getting results and maybe there's unrest within the players of the way that Wales are potentially trying to play the game, spoken about on the podcast, spoken about it on the YouTube platform, about how many phases they go and the style that they play. And if you lose your belief in that and you lose the belief in the coach and where you're heading, ultimately, if that coach then goes, it's never nice to see, but if he goes, there's actually sometimes there's relief in the camp. There's this sense of like, oh, finally, like that needed to happen. Like we needed change, we needed fresh ideas, and we needed a new voice. We need a new view in terms of how to play. Like it wasn't working for us. So although there'll be relationships that Gatland's got with these players over the years of what he's done, it can become very stale in the end. And sometimes when the decision's made, when the players all want change, there's not a huge amount you can do as players. There isn't. It has to be done from the powers to be. And when the powers to be step in, intervene and make the change, sometimes the mood is actually like, do you know what? I'm glad it's done now. I'm glad that the book's closed, the ink's dry, that chapter's done, and we can crack on. And I guess the intriguing thing is now, like, what does the next one look at? And I'd throw a question back at you, Squidge. Do you think ultimately Gatland has fallen on his sword in the end? You look at his tenure the first time around, was there for a long, long time, great success. Was that an issue that he never looked at? What happens when he's gone? What happens when this golden generation of Welsh players have all gone? So it's almost like he then came back, and because he probably overlooked, because being the head guy, you do have a responsibility for the academies, the development systems, the pathways. You're the head guy in charge of the whole lot. Yes, there's powers above you, but you're the coach. You have to have an idea of what that looks like. So has he, in a strange way, having had so much success during the successful years, maybe just thought it was a treadmill of Welsh talent, and the funding got cut from certain pathways, but ironically, he left, came back, and then fallen on his sword because he maybe neglected that area due to the golden talent he had, and maybe thought that it was going to last forever. And actually, when he needed that the next generation, the infrastructure was never put in place under his tenure.
Yeah, I think that's massively the case. I think there's been a lot of that. And then you had when Wayne Pivac did take over, and there was no real attempt to develop young players. You look at the way he went about it, was that Pivac liked options, I think, rather than developing players. As we hear Gatland himself talk about, Eddie Jones talk about countless times, of wanting players to have a certain number of caps by the time you get to a World Cup. Pivac instead would cap 20 players, and if they had one good game for Wales in like 3 appearances, then they were an option, and he'd kind of put them on the pile and they'd sit there. And it meant Wales had lots and lots of players who were okay, but no one had kicked on. He didn't have another generation come through in the middle. And then Gatland came back in and kind of tried to speed run that, and we were left with a situation where suddenly those guys went, and there was a massive gap where in a few years, the only players Wales really brought through that were regularly starting were Lewis Rees-Zammit, who then, ends up sitting watching the Super Bowl at home at the weekend instead of playing against Italy. And, then you kind of asking questions of, is there anyone else? Gareth Thomas, I suppose, came in that period as well. And it's a very, very small list. Then Jack Morgan and Dewi Lake appeared towards the end of that run. But there was very little effort. But then that also comes back to, you look at the way in which the W reformed the academy system. They got rid of the Central Academy in the late noughties, early 2010s, somewhere in the early 2010s. They got rid of the system that had produced the likes of Sam Warburton, Lee Halfpenny, George North, Jamie Roberts, etc., as a cost-saving measure. So that disappeared. And then the budgets of the regions came down massively. So you both had, I think, the fact that there was a lack of quality coaching below the head coach at the regions for a long time. You didn't necessarily have people across the pathways that were bringing through the next generation and were properly able to kind of identify and help talent out until they got right up to the top of that pyramid. And then, the budget beyond that, in the last 20 years, Wales have only capped 4 players who qualified on residency after the age of 18. They haven't had, as Ireland and Scotland have been able to lean on, signing overseas players who can come in and qualify residency and then play in positions where they're weak. That hasn't been the case with the Welsh regions because they haven't had the budget. So there's been a big player issue here, just the drain of it. And then, as you say, in some ways, Gatland's fallen on his sword, but in other ways, I think there is a crop of talent that is good enough to be doing better than they are at the minute.
It's amazing. It's like you almost feel like if they don't act and change on almost the aftermath of what's happened, then it can just be like this, a revolving door for a long, long time. So it's almost like you just mentioned there, Squidge. It's some Gatland, it's some WRU, it's some systems, it's funding, it's getting players. It's all these things, but until they get a total alignment, you may not see it for a few more years. But it's almost like they've got to sit around the table and thrash it all out.
As a player, what do they do now? Do they take charge? We've got Matt Sherritt is supposedly coming in on Monday. So they've got a few days without that. Obviously, the assistant coach is supposedly still there. We won't find out at this stage. What does that look like as a player?
So there's still a few senior lads in there. Liam Williams being one, Toby Falatau, Tulupi Falatau being another, Josh Adams. As senior players, if I was in this situation, I think you reassure the group that, boys, this is professional sport, and ultimately you're judged on results and it's gone. Gats has gone, right? It's about what we do next. And I dare say a lot of them were probably hoping for some change, to be honest with you. That, you don't get to that stage without players recognising that something needs to give and something needs to change. So I think you sit down, you're really transparent with the boys, you see if there's anyone who wants to voice any concerns. A lot of it won't be. I think a lot of it will be like, it's happened, it's what we do next, boys, And I think it's when guys step up. And I think for young guys in that group, they'll be looking at senior figures of how they act and how they go about it. And that's the important thing. And there'll be an element where you kind of just have to take on a bit more responsibility than maybe you have done before. So that is checking in with players. That is the level that you bring to training. That is, it's almost becomes under your watch a bit more now because you've lost someone like Gats. But obviously with Matt coming in, and his connection with Cardiff, he'll know some of the Cardiff boys. I'm sure he's come across a lot of the guys anyway that haven't played with Cardiff. I think that when someone comes through like that, I imagine it'll be refreshing. He'll bring some energy to the group. And I think guys will just be keen to rip in. It's almost like doing it this week, although it's kind of bizarre, it's like they've made that decision and actually it leads them, just under 2 weeks as they lead into Ireland, which is their next game. And you almost wonder sometimes, when your back's against the wall, I think they call it dead cat bounce, where basically even a dead cat will bounce. So you'll get some sort of in football, when you make managing changes, you suddenly see a little spike in performances. And perhaps you'll see that with this Welsh team. But, Matt coming in, can you tell me a bit more about him as a coach and what he could implement quickly? What would his overall philosophy, do you think, be? Will it be similar to what we've seen from Wales, or will it be totally different?
I think he's a very different coach. I think he had a brief stint with Wales in 2017 when Gatland was on the Lions tour. He came as an attack coach. He worked, as an attack coach around, both the Premiership and URC an awful lot. It was with the Ospreys previously and Worcester, and then, had 2 stints at Cardiff, and then had a reasonably similar situation where Di Young left Cardiff very suddenly and he ended up stepping up as head coach and has taken over since full time and done a very good job by all accounts. It is one of these other things. The funny things is that even though the situation, you say, is pretty unprecedented to change coach mid Six Nations, you've had the Ospreys and Dragons have both changed coach mid-season this year, and Cardiff did it 18 months ago. So most of this squad will have been through this before already, which maybe helps. But yeah, I think Sherritt is an attack coach by trade, and that's always been the way he's wanted to play. And his Cardiff team, almost to a fault, have been very attack focused since he's come in. But I think the really reassuring thing, and perhaps the most positive thing, and why I think he's a really smart appointment to come in, is that if you look at that period when he first took over with Cardiff, there was an awful lot going on. There was Di Young left the job very suddenly at, literally a few days' notice before they were playing a local derby. You then had the various contract situation that led to the player strike and so on around that. And most notably, Cardiff then started his first season as head coach with only 6 players contracted, and he had to sort all of this, and like they didn't have players turning up to training, and they had all sorts going on. And the thing that he did incredibly well was both from, you know, having spoken to people involved around the club, in terms of the way he got the messaging across the players, the way he rebuilt belief, but beyond that, also the way he communicated with fans. And he was always very articulate and very smart in the way that he was able to get across what was going on, very honest, and make that point. And I think he's a really smart appointment because if nothing else, I think he will get the messaging right in a way that Gatland hasn't always. Gatland hasn't always had the things that fans want to hear over the last few months, as this run's got worse and worse. And I think Sherritt is much more likely to have kind of a level of honesty, which Gatland has brought, but also, you know, considering the fans' point of view. But yeah, as you said, then, you know, you then throw in like perhaps a more attacking brand of rugby, which will be a big surprise for England, Ireland and Scotland. I don't know how much he can change in 3 weeks, but if there's even like a few tiny changes he can make and tweaks and how he plays the game, then I think it could be very, very interesting.
It also gets rid of, one thing I'd say from a player's point of view as well, Squidge, is the longer you go without winning a game, the more the burden becomes. And then almost because he's gone, now the expectation is, because internally you've still got huge expectation, play for Wales, you want to win, you want to break this duck of losses. And now almost it's like, boom, line in the sand. It's like, we've got nothing to lose. The expectation is zero. Like, you know, Matt's coming in, like we can evolve our game really quickly or tweak it, as you say, try and do some subtle change, especially in the attack, because the amount of phase they go for such little return, you'd expect that to see a little change straight away in terms of those patterns and the way they do it. And it's almost like now it's like we can just, it's a free swing. If Wales lose the next 3, like no one's surprised. It's like, okay, they lost the last 2. If they actually push a team or he gets them to play, you know, gets a tune out of them, like it starts looking positive. So when I got asked the other day, and when we did a video this morning, Coley and asked me, you know, what the positive for Welsh fans, I couldn't find an answer apart from, you know, you get to play in the greatest stadium in the world, in my opinion. Can you now see a bit more of a positive?
I think so. I think, as you say, there's a bit of a free swing. You look at Matt Sherritt's Cardiff team. He was in charge when they had the kind of now infamous week where, due to the URC being ridiculous, they had a bunch of players caught up with COVID in a hotel in South Africa. And it meant they were literally calling in, like, you know, they had a primary school teacher as the replacement hooker. They had like a couple of students in the starting team. Like they had, you know, guys from like down the local chip shop playing in the second row. And it was amazing. And they kind of came together and they were playing against Toulouse with Dupont and Untermack and Cyril Bay and like the whole team out. And they gave absolutely everything. And I think Sherritt very much fostered that and was with Cardiff then. And he very much built that spirit of like, we'll just have a swing because we are completely outmatched here and we'll give it a go. And like they scored the first try and they kind of, you know, built some things and they had a good game relative to what they were playing. And I think there's kind of that spirit is what Wales need to embody, because the Gatland approach wasn't working. As you said, the pressure was building and building and building. And I think this does give them a chance to be a bit looser and a bit freer and just kind of have a bit of a crack. And I'm not saying they'll beat Ireland, but I think there is much more chance to go out and do something, because suddenly you aren't burdened by Warren Gatland's legacy and you aren't burdened by what's come before even. Like even the last 2 weeks, like it is a new, fresh idea.
Do you know what as well, Squidge? If I was playing against that and I'm playing against a team where there's zero expectation and they're chucking the kitchen sink at us and we are just like holding on, the burden of, oh my gosh, we might actually lose this becomes like the closer the clock ticks, the tighter the score is, you're thinking, oh no, this can't be. And that, again, that all paves it. It all adds up, right? Because like I say, it's a free swing for them, but actually for the next 3 opponents, like you're going in with expectations to just put them away, and it's like, it's okay, put them away, and Wales will figure it out after the tournament. Straight away, there's sort of obviously rumours will be sent around who comes in, who's going to be the long-term replacement. Is there anyone stand? Obviously, Simon Easterby's doing a great job with Ireland, it seems. He has done for years, but obviously there was concerns about Andy Farrell, then him coming in, coach the Scarlets, of course. Do you think it's very much Matt's to lose or Simon's to gain, or what do you see that looking like?
Well, the interesting thing in the press release is they say that they're going to look for they very much make the point that Matt Sherritt's a short-term thing, at least for now, and they're going to look to appoint someone by the 2 Test series in Japan, which sets a bit of a time frame there. The names that have been bandied about, the names that have come up, are Michael Checker, who I believe you've met. I believe, the two of you have been in contact at some point in the last 30 years. And then Simon Easterby, and I've gone blank on the other name. Who was it? Franco Smith from Glasgow is the other name that's being bandied about. However, there's also talk of, does Franco Smith come into Scotland if Gregor Townsend doesn't pick things up? So that could be a really interesting patch, because you potentially got both those jobs, coming up in the next period of time. Checker would be very interesting, but again, you'd know much better than me. Simon Easterby is married to Sarah Elgin, so therefore is Welsher than anyone else in the world. I think that puts you in the top percentile of Welshness. And so, as that from that point of view, I think would do a great job. He's clearly doing a good job with Ireland. Will have learned an awful lot being involved in that system, both with the national team and also seeing up close the Leinster system and so on. And one of the other things that, as well as the head coach job that's now vacant, Wales lost their director of rugby and performance in the autumn in Nigel Walker, and haven't filled that void yet. So that's potentially open as well. And, I think Stuart Lancaster's name I'd throw out there as would be a really good spot. Now he's left Racing. And potentially that's another name that can go in there as a coach. So whether any of these people would want it is the other question, whether they're interested at all. But there are names out there, and I think it's in a healthier place. Dave Rennie, Jamie Joseph as well, coaching in rugby and Super Rugby and in Japan, and maybe gettable. So I think there's actually a much healthier list of coaches available now than if they had got rid of him maybe this time last year after the wooden spoon.
I tell you what though, Squidge, if you're Matt Sherritt, surely it's yours to lose because you got the first shot at it. But you are getting on the phone to Gareth Anscombe. I am straight away. If I was in that position, I'm like, I need my 10. Get yourself here. And your second's probably to Max Llewellyn. And you're like, you can get here as well. Because you do, again, wonder, how are you missing out on Anscombe? Given the way that him and Thomas Williams know each other so well. They play together regularly at Gloucester, of course. They've been doing great guns. It's just surely you're making that call straight away. Or maybe he's ringing him and saying, mate, now that Gat's get me in, I'm here, I want to play for Wales, pick me.
And that's so Sherritt worked with Anscombe rather when he first came over to Cardiff, and then when Sherritt went to the Ospreys, Anscombe followed him. So that is entirely possible. He then worked with Llewellyn as well at Cardiff, so there is a relationship there. He very much rates both those players. So I wouldn't be surprised, because that is one of the really weird things about coming into an international squad, when the previous guys called it up based on the players he wants, and suddenly you're just left with this squad. Yeah, surely the likes of Gareth Anscombe come in, and possibly a few of those Cardiff players as well, who he knows he can trust and rely on.
It screams of it, doesn't it? Because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Squidge, you spoke about Gatland's legacy earlier. What does this mean for that?
Yeah. I think ultimately, though, Warren Gatland is the best coach Wales have ever had in terms of results, in terms of silverware, in terms of what he achieved and also what he built, in terms of that generation of players. He's certainly the best they've had since the 70s and John Taylor and John Dawes, rather. And that is not diminished. I think the things he achieved in his first stint and the way he built Wales from their worst ever world ranking at the time to being world number one, to those 2 World Cup semi-finals, to 2019 where they were genuine contenders to go out and win it, and won that series of Grand Slam, series of Six Nations titles, any number of things they achieved for the first time or new records broken. And you look at Wales have only beaten South Africa something like, I think 5 times in history, and 4 of them were under Warren Gatland or something like that. I think 6 maybe. The stats slightly off, but his impact on Welsh rugby was enormous. And that is not diminished by what's happened in the last few months. At the same time, though, his legacy shouldn't soften what's happened over the last 18 months, which is that he has come in and his second stint as Wales coach has been amongst the least successful by any Test coach in the professional era. It's the worst Wales have had in the professional era. And those two things do coexist. And I think ultimately, in a few years' time, once time has passed, we will look back on Warren Gatland as Wales coach for what he did in his first stint. And this second stint had a very good World Cup in the middle of an otherwise very forgettable time that was sort of an error and a mistake. And I'll personally, as a fan, I'll never hold it against him. You know, I'll always think on his legacy as that of the best coach Wales ever had. He just also happened to have a spell as the worst.
Yeah. I mean, 2 weeks ago, he was saying, write Wales off at your peril. But on Saturday, he generally looked like a broken man post-game, didn't he? Do you think it was an element of he maybe knew that his time was up at the end of the tournament and equally was just totally emotionally and physically drained from the experience that he just felt like it's now?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a level of that. I think he was asked before the tournament if he was sure he wanted to go on, and he said he'd been having those conversations repeatedly with his wife of like, why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself through this? And I get it. You know, it's an awful lot of pressure and a stress to go through. That attention and your name, and should you still have a job, being the thing people talk about constantly. So yeah, I don't blame him at all. And I think, as we were saying earlier, that weight being freed might help the players a little bit as well, in terms of that not being, you know, there won't be so much pressure on it.
So Wales, the last few weeks, I've been really critical about having, like, they haven't had the dent to marry up with the amount of phases they go. So when I look at the Sage Insights, you know, they passed the ball 129 times against Italy, but just for such little return. Can you just give, like, the listeners or everyone just a little insight about Sherratt's, the way he likes to play, and what do you think, you know, the quick fixes from Cardiff he can bring to the national team?
You probably can't change, and again, you'd know better than me, but so much of that game plan can't be changed in the 2 weeks before the Ireland game. And especially can't be changed to a standard in which you can then go and beat maybe the second best team in the world at the minute, and now the favourite for the tournament. That is probably a big ask. However, what he can tweak is probably there's a lot of those things about the attack, and like I completely agree with all the points you've made on the pod over how poor Wales' attack's been, how just like scripted and shapeless. But if you dig into it, I made this point in a video on the Wales-France game, but Wales as dummy runners and they're running off the ball is atrocious.
Horrendous. It's horrendous.
It's just awful, isn't it? Just
it's awful. Might as well not be there.
Yeah, exactly. You've got like players running on the insiders.
No change of pace at line. No turning someone's inside shoulders up. Not even got their arms up in case they do play short. Like this is so scripted like, and bad.
No one's got their hands up to like pretend they're going to catch the ball. Even like it's nothing the entire way. And like, one thing Sherratt can change is just coming in and going like, no, Will Rowlands, put your hands up. You know, like pretend you're going to try and catch the ball to players, and you know, little tiny tweaks like that can probably be changed in the week that might allow the shape that is there to be 10% more threatening. And then there probably will be just like slightly more emphasis on playing, on just keeping the ball going, because that is how they've very much played at Cardiff, and that might be. In some ways, I think the enemy in Welsh rugby at the minute is apathy as much as anything, and it is the fact you've got a Welsh rugby public who is switching off and losing interest. And if you can just get them playing a style of rugby that's more exciting, even if they do lose all 3 games, perhaps that's just something to undo a bit of the damage.
What's with the game against Ireland, as you just alluded to? Good luck to the lads. Apart from saying that, what was your honest predictions about how that would go, and what would you like to see? Like, what would you like to see when they face Ireland?
I think I would like to see them just give it a go. And that sounds maybe, I don't know, both vague and unoptimistic. I don't think Wales are going to beat Ireland. I don't think there's, you could play that game 100 times and 99 of them Ireland win, and the other one's an asteroid strike that, means the game doesn't go ahead. And I don't think Wales have got much shot of actually winning that game. But what they do have is a chance to go out and go, okay, if we can score a few tries, or if we can at least put some pressure on Ireland, if we can keep in control of the game, if we can build a bit of a scoreboard, we can perhaps not get nilled again, then, I don't know, I think there's a real chance to prove a point and to prove they can be something different, and just show a bit of like the passion and fire that we've seen players working incredibly hard, but it hasn't necessarily felt like there's been very little joy to it, I think. It's the point Ellis Jenkins, the former Wales flanker, made quite recently, that none of these players feel like they're enjoying their time in international rugby, which should be like a pinnacle they've worked so hard for. And perhaps if we can see some of that, then I think that could be really, really big and really great for, like, as a fan, it's what I want to be seeing.
there's a bloke, isn't there, that's running a mile for the amount of points Wales lose by.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I tell you what, he might be happy with the changes made, and maybe he'll be running less miles potentially after the Ireland game. But let's hope so.
Has he got to run in different shoes now? Has he changed that?
Yeah, I don't know, but he's probably the happiest man ever. That maybe with, like I say, now with the changes, perhaps you're going to see, like you mentioned there, what you want to see from Wales, and I think they will have a go. So, mate, thanks to Brewdog, because every nation needs a black heart. Thanks to Sage for the insight, and thank you, Squidge. If for some reason you haven't actually watched his YouTube channel yet, please do. Check it out. So good. Just search Squidge on YouTube and you'll find him. There is a reason why Ant Watson called you the Oracle in our quiz, mate, because you know
that's on
so
business
much.
Cards now. That's on T-shirts. Yeah.
You've got merchandise. I love that. Make sure you leave us a review on the podcast app and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Let's see what Wales bring in the next few weeks.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.